Great to have you with us, you this evening. Peter is an author, journalist, speaker. I do like it on his website where he says he's a weirdo, which I just. But so that is, yeah, it does say that on his.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, creator of Creepy Cove, and yeah, Peter, over to you. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, just a brief bit of background, really, to why I do the things I do these days. Is growing up at school and up until I went to university, I wasn't only a person who didn't go to church, I was actively antagonistic towards Christianity. I'm not sure why. I just found Christians to be offensive and lacking interest in me and lacking love. So for me, my experiences of Christians tended to be either on TV, Harold Bishop, and Dot Cotton on EastEnders, those sorts of role models, and then occasionally sort of trendy young kind of hipster youth workers who would come into the RE class and sit and play a guitar and sort of try to appeal to us on a trendy level. And I was quite cynical about that, even though I ended up doing that myself years later. But the bottom line is, I just thought, you're not interested in me because I happen to really love horror films and scary things. And I'm interested in ghosts and UFOs and monsters and Bigfoot and all that stuff. And whenever I would talk to them about those things, it would be, well, that's evil, or that's dangerous or whatever. And so it's almost like, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you've shared, have you seen that new Netflix show? Isn't it good? And they say, no, it's crap. I hated it. And there's just this instance of, okay. There's like a disconnect, or someone, disagrees with what football team you support or whatever. And I found that on a more kind of deeper level with Christians who just dismissed something that was very meaningful to me, not just for entertainment, but also for an arena in which I was exploring deep questions. Because I felt, of all films in culture, horror films were the ones that were asking big questions, like, is there life after death? Does the supernatural exist? Is there such a thing as good versus evil, an objective evil? But no, that was just sort of dismissed as an aside, and also told, well, if you ever wanted to become a Christian, you'd obviously have to drop all of that stuff, which is in a way like saying to a heterosexual person or a homosexual person, well, you'll obviously have to stop fancying guys. You know what I mean? It's because it's a fundamental part of your makeup. You think, well, I don't even know if I'd be capable of doing that. So I was totally put off Christians. And this antagonized me a bit because it felt like there was a ring fence for certain types of people with certain interests to connect with God. And that started to manifest in me being annoying to Christians. I was a good student. I was nice to everyone. I was well behaved. But in RE class, I used to sneak in to the RE teacher's classroom and get the Bibles. And when she was not there, I'd get my pen and I'd circle Satan in her Bibles, the school Bible. So I started a little band called Creatures of the Night, where we sang songs about spitting on the Bible and Jesus being lame and all of this sort of anti-Christianity stuff. I wasn't a Satanist or anything, but I don't know, it was just an anger at like, so I'm not allowed to access that stuff, so fine. Anyway, years later, and this is a long story, so I won't tell it, but I became a Christian at university, which was really quite a shock to everybody, especially going home and to my home in the Northeast, and other friends saying, wow, I thought you were a devil worshiper. What are you doing messing around with that? But I was like, no, this is legitimate. And anyway, once I became a Christian, I kind of thought, I need to try and go cold turkey on these films and not watch them anymore. And because eventually they're telling me that I'll change. And so my interest in those things will change, but they never did. And what people didn't seem to understand or appreciate was the only thing that really got me taking Christianity seriously was horror films, and specifically films like The Exorcist, for example, that I've met multiple people who have started their conversion journey after watching that film. And yet most of the Christians I met were calling it blasphemous and demonic and the famous line by Billy Graham is that there is evil within the very celluloid of the film itself. Whereas then I later discovered that the film was banned in Tunisia on the basis of it being Christian propaganda, because it is so pro-Christian. And so I was finding myself saying, well, hang on a minute. I found my way to this spirituality, which means a lot to me. And the route that I took was through these controversial areas, but they were meaningful to me. But now I have to ignore that stuff. Anyway, I did my dissertation in preaching for my master's, my theology master's, and I wanted to explore the idea of, well, what happens if horror films can preach? You know, can you use horror as a way of connecting? And it wasn't very long until I realized totally, absolutely. And then I started to host a podcast, which was called The Flicks That Church Forgot, which is me just reviewing horror films and offering Christian points of view on it. But the majority of people who listened to that weren't Christians, because Christians didn't normally admit to liking horror. And then in time, I just started meeting more and more Christians who were coming out as horror fans, including little old ladies in the church I was a minister of at the time, you know, saying, I love this stuff too, but not feeling capable of saying it before. Anyway, so after a while, it started to make me realize it's a bit like what I think, what Jean said earlier, that, you know, your quirky interests are not just bespoke to one single human on the planet. It's such a huge planet that I think once you work out what your quirk is, the chances are there's someone out there who has a very similar, if not identical, quirk to you. And so I thought, well, you know, I want to connect with other people, because I don't think anyone else wants to do this or is interested in this or thinks it's safe or thinks it's, you know, demonic. And so for the past 10 years, I've kind of stepped away from being a minister because this sort of space started to open up to me. I started writing books and was amazed to get multiple book deals. I started podcasting. I started writing for a magazine called The Fortean Times, which is a very well-respected but secular magazine that explores the supernatural, and then started getting invited to speak at paranormal conferences and all these sorts of places. And I just started to find myself as I'm a person who everyone knows I'm a Christian, and I was ordained by that time as well. So I wasn't hiding the fact that I was ordained as a church minister, but there was something about the fact that I was admitting that I liked horror films, which was so weird that it just seemed to get people's attention. And it made people say, well, that doesn't make sense. Or what, aren't you supposed to be a kind of Stepford wife? Like, aren't you supposed to be like a robot who only likes Cliff Richard? like, how could you possibly like normal stuff? Or there'd be other people who would be, how could you like evil stuff? And that'd be the Christians often. And so I spent, you know, I wrote a book on the topic called The Frighteners, Why We Love Monsters, Ghosts, Death, and Gore, which was, again, a secular book for an English publisher and a Taiwanese publisher and an American publisher. And that took me to Transylvania and to Rome and all across Britain, meeting people who love scary things. And in that book, I was trying to say that it's a normal part of human culture. And for time immemorial, we have used scary stories and ghost stories and true crime and horrible things to help us cope with the frightening things of this world. Not everybody does it. Not everyone has the taste for it, but millions upon millions of people do. And because I do, I want to connect with those people because I have a pastoral feel for those people. And what I noticed with this book, in the front of the book, I wrote something like, you know, I dedicated the book to my kids, and I said, basically, this is a long book explaining why, you know, horror is reasonable and understandable to be interested in. But ultimately, you don't have to read the book to understand the message of the book, which is simply be yourself, be you. And that's what I discovered, that it's possible for me to be this weird, quirky person who likes these strange things, but also be authentically myself in front of God. And this was revolutionary for me because that's what I was being told I couldn't be when I was younger. That, well, you can come to God, but you can't be you. You have to be someone else. That's a huge, huge thing to ask people, and frustrating when you realize it was really down not to thinking about the theology of it all. It was down to personal taste. Well, I don't like those films, so they must be dodgy. Anyway, so what's happened in the last few years is I've started to discover myself getting more well known. I'm not famous by any stretch, but I'm definitely not famous, but I have had people come up to me on trains and I've read your book, I've seen you in this, I heard you in this, and sometimes being described as the sinister minister, which, you know, it's a bit dodgy. Sounds like kind of weird, you know, pedophile priest or something, but that's not really what I'm going for. But it's this idea of, oh, you're the guy who likes scary things, but is also happy to be a minister. And one of the most, I think, interesting expressions of that has happened in the last few years during lockdown, which is what Jean talked about a little bit before, which was this project that I started called Creepy Cove Community Church. And I started this because during lockdown, my latest novel had come out, which is about the rise in demonic possession and demand for exorcism, and they're like crime novels that I write. But I didn't really want to go straight into write a new novel. In fact, in lockdown, I didn't even want to read any novels. I just went totally off reading. But podcasting came onto the radar simply because I noticed that I was having a surprisingly meaningful experience of church through my computer and through my headphones. I thought it was going to be super lame, sitting down, eating breakfast and watching church on TV because I wasn't physically with the people. And I went, wow, no, actually, I'm connecting with this. And also I had the choice to switch this one off and try this one. You know, it was interesting. It was an interesting new way of doing it, interesting new model. But I found I'm getting connection with spirituality through this. So what about all of my friends who feel they can't access this because they like scary things? And if I told them, go to your local church, they might be told all the same things I was told. Well, stop liking that first. Stop wearing black. And so I started Creepy Cove Community Church, which was a podcast, which is basically a full and immersive church service that people listen to. And it's broadcast from a mysterious haunted fishing town, a fictional town, obviously. But it is a town that nonetheless, when people listen to it, it sounds like you're listening to a church service because there's characters and there's notices at the start and there's eerie prayers and there's always a horror hymn, which is a kind of like a slightly bizarre, quirky, funny or sinister sounding hymn. And there's these little Creepy Cove plectrums that people sometimes get, which says God of the minor chord, which is trying to kind of encourage people to say God likes minor chords as well as major chords. But that was very interesting because I started that and I just started getting messages from people who said, I love this. This is helping me. I'm very proud to say I go to Creepy Cove Community Church, but I'm an atheist, or I'm a Satanist, or I don't agree with Christianity necessarily, but this feels like a safe space for me to be in a church. And it is safe because they can switch it straight off, but it's also safe because I designed it to allow difference. So when I lead a prayer in there, I'll say, right, I'm going to pray. I'll mention maybe Jesus or God, but if that really makes you feel uncomfortable, feel free to swap that out for something different if that's what you want. Or we're going to have a meditation now, or in the sermons, I'll say, well, this is, what I think as a Christian, but you may totally disagree with it, or indeed I might be wrong. Maybe God doesn't exist, because that's possible. I totally make it possible for an anti-theist to feel at home. But I'm authentically myself in that, and they're authentically themselves in that space. And that just seems to be creating something that is working. And I get messages quite often of people from all around the world, mostly in America and England, of people saying, it's the similar things to what people said to me when I was a minister coming off, not off stage, which got off, when you come off at the end, they do like the Royal Variety performance bit where you stand and you're like, thanks for coming. And doing that and all the same things, but just via email or messenger or whatever, or Twitter, people saying, that was meant for me, that, or I was in tears listening to that, thank you. Or even couples. I did a thing about couples, and love and romance and stuff, and couples getting in touch and saying, me and my husband were really thinking about divorce, but we've been listening to this and this is really making quite a big difference, which is amazing. But it's also got werewolves in it and vampires, and all the characters in the church are people from horror films. So we did a carol service, and Jack Torrance, the big killer from The Shining, he was in the carol service playing the innkeeper, I think. It's totally nuts. It's so absurd. But when you say it to people and you say it's basically like Songs of Praise meets Stephen King, they go, okay. And if they listen to it, for some people, it connects. So that's I'll wrap up there. But the point of it is, it doesn't have to be horror. And I appreciate even you may find that too controversial, but it can be the quirkiest part of your personality. It's such a big world, and it's so easy to connect with people, particularly through podcasting and through the internet, that it is totally possible to connect with those people on the most niche of interests. And because you're dealing with the world and not just your own geography, you potentially could end up with quite a lot of people. So the Creepy Cove is currently in the top 5% of global podcasts, which means that's pretty popular. But it's not super popular. I do 2 other podcasts, which are ones I get paid for an American company. One's called Frightful, which is scary true stories, and the other one's called Hometown History Europe. And they are in the top 1%, and they're big enough to get advertisers, and so I get paid for those, and that's all great. But Creepy Cove, because it's in the top 5%, means it's very popular, but it's not that popular to get advertising and stuff. So I set up a Patreon to try and fund that, and got patrons for that, but still not quite enough for me to not have to get a chaplaincy job. So I'm doing two days of chaplaincy. I was working in an estate agent for a while, but I've stepped back from that because new podcast things are opening. So it's a fascinating and wild kind of ride. But the bottom line is being yourself and being you, and being willing not to say, well, my guilty pleasure is the Kardashians. You know what I mean? But being able to say, I like the Kardashians. So what? You know what I mean? And being able to just own your interests without thinking someone else is going to stamp on them, because they often do. And you'll find someone out there who'll go, oh, cool. You admit that you like that. So do I. Thank you for not stamping on it. That can be gold. So yeah, I'll wrap up there.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter. Like, it's so good to hear your story. And I think it's great hearing from Eugene and David, kind of like the reason why you're here tonight. And so now we've got just a bit of time, like if you want to ask Peter any questions or anything from kind of what Tim was saying earlier on about kind of fresh expressions and the kind of journey that you can go on, like in exploring something new. But yeah, I don't know if there's any questions that you've got that you'd like to ask.